She thought marriage would save her from hunger now. She prayed it wouldn't kill her son, a beaten wife, a sickly child, a stranger's kindness that changes everything when hope walks through the door disguised as a weathered rancher. The bruise on Clara Mee's cheek had turned from purple to yellow, marking 3 days since Frank's last rage. She pressed a damp cloth to little Samuel's fevered forehead and tried not to think about what would happen when her husband returned from town. The boy's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle that made Clara's chest tighten with fear she couldn't name. Samuel was 4 years old but looked no bigger than a child of 2, his limbs thin as kindling and his skin pale as morning frost. Frank called him worthless. Clara called him precious. The difference in those words had cost her 2 teeth and a rib that still ached when she breathed too deep. Outside their one-room shack, the Texas heat pressed down like a flat iron, but inside Samuel shivered beneath every quilt Clara owned. She'd been up 3 nights straight, spooning water between his cracked lips and singing lullabies that seemed to be the only thing that calmed his restless sleep. Her own stomach cramped with hunger. She'd given Samuel her portion of cornmeal again, but watching his tiny chest rise and fall was worth every pang. Frank would be back soon from selling their last chicken in town, and if Samuel was still sick, if he was still weak, if he cried at the wrong moment or breathed too loud or existed in any way that reminded Frank of his shame, there would be another beating, maybe one that Clara wouldn't recover from this time. The sound of hooves outside made her freeze. Too early for Frank. He never returned before dark, preferring to spend their meager earnings on whiskey and the kind of company that didn't ask questions about bruises. Clara moved to the cracked window and peered through the grime. A stranger sat tall in his saddle, his horse a magnificent chestnut that spoke of money and care. The man himself looked weathered but solid, with silver threading through dark hair beneath a hat that had seen better years but still held its shape. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, and when he approached their door, Clara noticed he removed his hat, something Frank never did, even in church. His knock was gentle, respectful. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Frank Hutchins. Name's William Garrett." Clara's hand trembled as she opened the door just wide enough to speak through the crack. Up close, she could see kindness in the man's weathered face, laugh lines around eyes that held no cruelty. "Frank's in town," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Won't be back till evening." William Garrett nodded, then his gaze shifted slightly, taking in the bruise on her cheek that no amount of powder could hide. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you would be Mrs. Hutchins, I reckon." "Clara Mee," she said, then immediately regretted giving her name to a stranger. Frank didn't like her talking to men, especially not men who looked at her with anything resembling respect. Behind her, Samuel began to cough, a harsh, rattling sound that seemed too big for his tiny frame. William's attention shifted immediately toward the sound, concern creasing his features. "Your boy sounds poorly, ma'am." Clara's instinct was to lie, to send this stranger away before Frank returned and found reasons to blame her for his visit. But something in William Garrett's voice, some note of genuine worry, made her hesitate. "He's been sick for days," she found herself admitting. "Fever won't break." "Might I?" William gestured toward the door, and Clara realized he was asking permission to enter, not demanding it. The novelty of being asked instead of told made her step back before she could think better of it. William entered their poor excuse for a home without judgment, though Clara saw his eyes take inventory of the bare walls, the empty shelves, the single pot that served for all their cooking. Samuel lay on the only bed, so small he barely made an impression in the worn mattress. The child's eyes opened at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, and Clara tensed, waiting for him to cry as he always did around Frank. Instead, Samuel studied the stranger with curious, fever-bright eyes. "Hello there, son," William said softly, approaching the bed with slow, careful movements. "You're not feeling too good, are you?" Samuel shook his head slightly, a gesture that took visible effort. "Mama says I'm sick," he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves. "Mama's right," William replied, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. Clara watched in amazement as Samuel didn't flinch or cry. He actually leaned slightly toward this gentle stranger. "But you know what? Sometimes being sick just means your body's working extra hard to get strong. Like a horse that's been running hard, needs time to catch its breath." Samuel's eyes widened with interest. "I like horses," he said, managing a smile that broke Clara's heart with its fragile beauty. "Do you now?" William's face lit up. "I've got a whole ranch full of them. Some are strong as thunderstorms, others gentle as morning rain, every one of them special in their own way." He glanced at Clara, then back at Samuel. "I bet if you were feeling better you'd like to see them sometime." "Really?" Samuel tried to sit up but fell back against his pillow, exhausted by the effort. "Easy, son," William said, his hand hovering near Samuel's forehead as if he wanted to check for fever but was waiting for permission. Clara found herself nodding, and William's palm pressed gently against the child's burning skin. "He's burning up," he murmured to Clara, worry clear in his voice. "I know," Clara whispered, tears threatening. "I don't know what else to do. The doctor in town costs more than we have, and Frank says—" She stopped herself before she could finish the sentence. "Frank said a lot of things about Samuel, none of them fit for decent company." William's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Hutchins, Clara, would you mind if I asked you something?" When she nodded hesitantly, he continued, "How long has your boy been sickly?" "Since he was born," Clara admitted. "Came early, too small, never quite caught up to other children his age. Frank says it's God's punishment for my sins, but I don't know what I did wrong." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, years of guilt and confusion spilling over in the presence of someone who didn't immediately blame her for her son's condition. William's face darkened with an emotion Clara couldn't name. "Ma'am, there's not a sin in this world that deserves to be paid for with a child suffering, and there's not a mother alive who hasn't done everything in her power to keep her baby safe." He looked at Samuel, who had drifted back toward sleep, one small hand curled against his chest. "This boy, he's got something special about him, can see it in his eyes." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Frank doesn't see it that way." "Frank's a fool," William said quietly, and the simple certainty in his voice made Clara's knees weak with relief. Someone else saw what she saw. Someone else didn't think Samuel was a burden or a punishment or a source of shame. The sound of approaching hooves made them both freeze. Clara's face went white as paper. "That's Frank," she whispered urgently. "You need to go, if he finds you here with me and Samuel." "I'm not going anywhere," William said calmly, rising from the bed but not moving toward the door. "I came to talk business with your husband, and that's what I'm going to do." Clara's hand shook as Frank's heavy footsteps approached the door. She knew that walk, unsteady from drink but still dangerous, still capable of violence. The door slammed open without ceremony, and Frank Hutchins filled the doorway like a thundercloud ready to break. Frank was a big man gone soft around the middle, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once before drink and meanness carved permanent lines around his mouth and eyes. He took in the scene. His wife, his sickly son, and a well-dressed stranger standing in his house, and his face flushed red with instant rage. "What the hell is this?" Frank's voice boomed in the small space, causing Samuel to whimper and curl tighter into his blankets. William Garrett didn't flinch at Frank's booming voice or threatening posture. Instead, he stepped forward with his hat in his hands, extending the other toward Frank in a gesture of introduction. "Mr. Hutchins, I presume. William Garrett, owner of the Double G Ranch north of here. I've been hoping to speak with you about some business." Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he studied William, clearly trying to decide if this was some kind of trick. The smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him in waves, and Clara shrank back against the wall, instinctively putting herself between Frank and Samuel's bed. She knew the signs, the way Frank's hands curled into fists, the way his jaw worked like he was chewing on his own anger. Someone was going to pay for this intrusion, and it would likely be her. Business? Frank's voice was suspicious, slurred just enough to be dangerous. What kind of business would a fancy rancher have with me? His gaze flicked to Clara, and she saw the accusation building in his eyes. Or maybe you ain't here for business at all. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dead fire. Clara's stomach twisted with familiar dread, but William's expression remained calm, almost amused. Well now, Mr. Hutchins, I can see how a man might jump to conclusions, but I assure you my interest is purely professional. I'm in need of good men for ranch work, and I heard tell you might be looking for steady employment. Frank's posture shifted slightly, greed warring with suspicion. Who told you that? Word travels in small towns, William replied smoothly. Man with your size and strength, I figured you might be interested in honest work that pays better than whatever you're doing now. He glanced meaningfully around the sparse cabin. Looks like your family could use some financial security. Clara held her breath. Frank's pride was a dangerous thing. Stroke it the wrong way and his temper would explode like dynamite in a campfire. But William seemed to understand exactly which words to use, painting Frank as the strong provider while offering him something he desperately needed: money. How much money we talking about? Frank asked, his stance relaxing fractionally. $40 a month plus room and board, William said. That's for a man willing to work hard from dawn to dusk, managing cattle, mending fences, whatever needs doing. Course, the work's demanding. Not every man can handle it. The challenge was perfectly pitched. Frank's chest puffed out slightly. I can handle any work you got, mister. Been working hard my whole life. Clara bit her tongue to keep from laughing bitterly. Frank's idea of hard work consisted mainly of drinking and complaining about his lot in life. But William nodded seriously, as if Frank's words carried weight. I believe you can, William said. Only thing is, the ranch is a day's ride north. You'd need to start Monday morning and stay through Saturday evening. Home on Sundays, of course, for family time. Clara's heart leaped. 6 days a week without Frank. 6 days without walking on eggshells, without jumping at every sound, without watching Samuel flinch every time his father entered the room. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Frank was thinking too, his brow furrowed with the effort. What's the catch? No man offers that kind of money without a catch. No catch, William said easily. Just honest pay for honest work. Though I'll be straight with you, I expect my men to show up sober and ready to work. No drinking on the job, no fighting with other hands. A man who can't control himself around whiskey can't be trusted around livestock. Frank's face darkened again. You saying I got a drinking problem? The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Clara could feel the violence building in Frank like pressure in a boiler, and she knew that one wrong word would send him into a rage that might not stop until someone was seriously hurt. But William's voice remained steady and reasonable. I'm saying I need men who can do the job, he replied. You look like a man who can handle responsibility. Question is whether you want the opportunity or not. Behind Frank, Samuel began to cough again, that harsh, terrible sound that seemed to scrape the inside of his tiny chest raw. Frank whipped around at the noise, his face twisting with disgust and anger. Can't you keep that boy quiet? He snarled at Clara. Every damn day with that coughing and whining makes a man sick to listen to it. Clara started to move toward Samuel, but Frank grabbed her arm with bruising force. I asked you a question, woman. He's sick, Frank, Clara whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. He can't help. He's weak, Frank snapped, his grip tightening until Clara gasped with pain. Weak and useless, just like his mother. Boy ain't even worth the food it takes to keep him breathing. Samuel's coughing fit worsened at the sound of his father's angry voice, his small body racked with spasms that made him sound like he was drowning. Clara tried to pull free from Frank's grip, desperate to comfort her son, but Frank held her fast. Please, she begged, let me help him. Help him? Frank laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Boy's been dying since the day he was born. Might be a mercy to just let him get on with it. The words hit Clara like physical blows. She'd heard Frank say cruel things about Samuel before, but never anything quite so callous, quite so final. Tears sprang to her eyes as she struggled against his grip, but Frank was too strong, too determined to make his point. That's when William Garrett stepped forward. "Let her go." The words were spoken quietly, without heat or obvious threat, but something in William's voice made Frank pause. Clara looked up through her tears to see William standing just 2 feet away, his weathered hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes holding a warning that even Frank couldn't miss. "This ain't none of your business, mister," Frank said, but his grip on Clara's arm loosened slightly. "You're right," William agreed, "but I make it my business when a man mistreats his family in front of me, shows poor character, makes me question whether he's the kind of man I want working for me." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Frank needed this job. They all knew it from the state of their cabin and the empty shelves, but his pride warred with his practical needs. Clara could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing his desire to assert dominance against the promise of $40 a month. Greed won, as William had clearly known it would. Frank released Clara's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling towards Samuel's bed. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't expect me to pretend that boy's anything more than he is." William watched Clara gather Samuel into her arms, the child's fevered body small and fragile against his mother's chest. When William spoke again, his voice carried a note of steel that made both Frank and Clara look up sharply. "That boy is your son," William said quietly. "Might want to remember that before you talk about letting children die. Tends to reflect poorly on a man's character." Frank's face flushed red again, but before he could respond, William continued in a lighter tone, as if he hadn't just delivered a subtle threat that left no doubt about where he stood. "Now then, about that job. You interested or not? I've got other men to talk to if you're not serious about the opportunity." The mention of other men, other opportunities, other chances for Frank to lose out on easy money, worked exactly as William had intended. Frank nodded quickly, his anger temporarily set aside in favor of greed. "I'm interested," he said. "When do I start?" "Monday morning, dawn. Meet me at the crossroads where the main trail splits north. We'll ride to the ranch together so I can show you around, introduce you to the other hands." William settled his hat back on his head, preparing to leave. "And Mr. Hutchins, bring work clothes and a sober head. First impressions matter." As William moved toward the door, his gaze fell on Clara and Samuel. The child had stopped coughing and was watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. When William smiled at him, Samuel managed a tiny smile in return, and something passed between the weathered rancher and the sickly child that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Ma'am," William said, tipping his hat to Clara, "it was a pleasure meeting you and your boy. I hope he feels better soon." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Frank was already mentally spending his wages, but Clara was thinking about something else entirely. The way William had looked at Samuel, not with pity or disgust, but with genuine warmth and interest. The way he defended them both without making Frank feel diminished. The way he'd offered hope in the form of a job that would take Frank away 6 days a week. As William's horse disappeared into the evening shadows, Clara held Samuel close and allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, their lives were about to change. Frank spent the evening planning what he'd do with his wages, talking about buying a better rifle, maybe some new boots. He was so excited about the prospect of steady money that he barely noticed Samuel's continued coughing or Clara's thoughtful silence. But Clara noticed everything. The way Samuel had smiled at William, the way William had called him son without mockery, the way hope felt in her chest, fragile and precious as a bird's egg. She didn't dare believe it yet, but for the first time in years, Clara Mee Hutchins fell asleep thinking about tomorrow. Monday morning arrived gray and cool, with the promise of another scorching day hidden behind thin clouds. Clara woke before dawn to find Frank already dressed and pacing their small cabin like a caged animal. For once, his restlessness came from excitement rather than drink or anger, and Clara marveled at the change in him. He'd actually bathed the night before, scrubbing off days of sweat and grime, and had laid out his cleanest shirt and least torn pants. The transformation was startling. When Frank made an effort, traces of the man she'd once thought she loved still showed through. "Coffee?" Frank demanded, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "Need to be sharp when I meet with Garrett." Clara moved quietly around their small space, building up the fire and setting water to boil. Samuel was still sleeping, his breathing easier than it had been in days but still concerning enough to make Clara check on him every few minutes. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him pale but peaceful, his small hand clutching the edge of his blanket. "Boy's been quiet," Frank observed, glancing toward the bed. "Maybe he's finally getting over whatever's been ailing him." Clara bit her tongue. Frank's sudden interest in Samuel's health had nothing to do with paternal concern and everything to do with his improved mood. When things were going Frank's way, he could almost pretend to be a decent husband and father. It never lasted, but Clara had learned to treasure these brief respites from his cruelty. The sound of approaching hooves sent Frank hurrying to the door. William Garrett sat his horse with the same easy grace Clara remembered, looking every inch the successful rancher in his clean clothes and well-maintained gear. His greeting was warm but businesslike, and Clara noticed how he managed to acknowledge her with a respectful nod while keeping his attention primarily focused on Frank. "Morning, Hutchins. Ready to see what you're made of." Frank's chest puffed with pride. "Born ready, Mr. Garrett." "Good to hear. We've got a full day ahead of us." William's gaze shifted briefly to Clara. "Mrs. Hutchins, I hope your boy's feeling better today." "Yes, sir," Clara managed, touched that he'd remembered and asked. "Fever broke during the night." "Glad to hear it." William's smile was genuine, and Clara felt that flutter of hope in her chest again. Boys that age bounce back quick when they're loved proper. The comment was innocent enough, but Clara saw Frank's jaw tighten slightly at the implication. Before he could say anything that might jeopardize his new opportunity, William was already turning his horse toward the trail. "Come on, Hutchins. Daylight's burning, and I want you to meet the crew before we put you to work." Frank mounted his old horse with less grace but equal determination. As they prepared to leave, Clara found herself holding her breath, hardly daring to believe that Frank was actually going, that she and Samuel would have 6 blessed days of peace. But just as Frank kicked his horse into motion, Samuel began to cough again. The sound was softer than before, but it still carried across the morning air. Frank reined in his mount, his face darkening with familiar annoyance. "Damn boy can't even stay quiet when his father's trying to work," Frank muttered, loud enough for William to hear. William's expression remained neutral, but Clara caught a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Children get sick," he said mildly. "Part of being a parent is dealing with it." Frank snorted. "Dealing with it's one thing. That boy's been sickly since the day he was born. Sometimes I think—" He stopped himself, glancing at William's carefully blank face. "You think what?" William's voice was casual, but Clara sensed an undercurrent of steel. Frank seemed to recognize that he was treading on dangerous ground. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just frustrated is all. Man wants his son to be strong." "Strength comes in different forms," William replied. "Some of the strongest people I've known looked weak on the outside." His gaze moved to Clara, then to the cabin where Samuel's coughing had subsided back into sleep. "Takes a special kind of courage to keep fighting when the odds are stacked against you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected defense of her son. Frank, meanwhile, looked uncomfortable, as if he sensed criticism but couldn't quite pin it down. "Well," Frank said after an awkward pause, "we should probably get going." "Indeed we should." William touched his hat brim toward Clara. "Ma'am, we'll have your husband back Sunday evening. You take care of yourself and that boy." As the two men rode away, Clara stood in her doorway watching until they disappeared into the morning haze. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to truly breathe. 6 days. 6 whole days without Frank's anger, without his constant criticism of Samuel, without the ever-present threat of violence hanging over their small family like a storm cloud. Inside the cabin, Samuel was stirring, his fever-bright eyes blinking open as consciousness returned. Clara hurried to his side, pressing her hand to his forehead and feeling profound relief at the cooler temperature. "Mama," Samuel's voice was hoarse but stronger than it had been in days. "I'm here, sweetheart." Clara smoothed his damp hair back from his face. "How do you feel?" Samuel considered the question with the seriousness that only sick children possessed. "Better," he said finally. The fever dream stopped. Clara's heart clenched. She'd known Samuel was having nightmares during his illness, but she hadn't realized he was aware of them. "What kind of dreams?" "Dark ones," Samuel whispered, his small hand finding hers. "Papa was angry and there was shouting and I couldn't breathe." His eyes, so much older than his 4 years, met hers. But then the nice man came and the dreams got quieter. Clara felt tears threaten again. Even in delirium, Samuel had somehow sensed William's presence as a calming influence. "The nice man's name is Mr. Garrett," she said gently. "He seemed to like you very much." Samuel's face lit up with the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him in weeks. "He said I could see his horses sometime. Do you think Papa would let me?" The question broke Clara's heart. Samuel was so accustomed to his father's refusal and anger that he couldn't even dream of simple pleasures without factoring in Frank's likely disapproval. "Maybe," Clara said carefully. "Papa's going to be working for Mr. Garrett now, so we might see him again." "I hope so," Samuel said softly. He had kind eyes, not like Papa's eyes when he's mad. Clara gathered her son into her arms, holding him close and marveling at how much lighter her heart felt without Frank's oppressive presence. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine what their lives might be like if this job worked out. If William Garrett proved to be the answer to prayers she'd barely dared to speak. The days that followed were a revelation. Without Frank's constant criticism and volcanic temper, Clara found herself remembering who she used to be before marriage had ground her spirit down to nothing. She sang while she worked, laughed at Samuel's innocent questions, and took time to really talk with her son instead of simply surviving from one crisis to the next. Samuel's recovery was remarkable. With his father's hostile presence removed and his mother's anxiety diminished, the boy seemed to bloom like a flower finally receiving sunlight. His appetite returned, his color improved, and most remarkably, his coughing fits became less frequent and less severe. Clara began to suspect that fear and stress had been contributing to Samuel's poor health all along. On Wednesday afternoon, as Clara was hanging laundry behind their cabin, she spotted a rider approaching. Her first instinct was panic, Frank returning early, probably drunk and angry about something that had gone wrong at the ranch. But as the figure drew closer, she realized it was William Garrett, riding alone. Clara smoothed her hair self-consciously and walked around to the front of the cabin to meet him. William dismounted with his usual grace, but Clara noticed he looked tired, older somehow than he had 3 days earlier. "Mr. Garrett," Clara said, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "Is everything all right? Frank hasn't." "Frank's fine," William assured her quickly. "Working hard, keeping his mouth shut, doing what he's told. Can't ask for much more than that from a new hand." Relief flooded through Clara. "Then what brings you by?" William seemed to consider his words carefully. "Truth is, ma'am, I wanted to check on your boy. Seemed pretty poorly when I met him and I've been thinking about him." He glanced toward the cabin. "How's he been feeling?" Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. When was the last time anyone besides her had asked about Samuel's welfare? "Much better," she managed. "The fever's gone and he's been eating more, sleeping peacefully too." "That's good to hear." William's smile was genuine and warm. "Children shouldn't have to suffer like that. Mind if I say hello to him?" Clara hesitated. Frank would be furious if he knew another man had visited while he was away, especially if that man had shown interest in Samuel. But looking at William's kind face, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes, Clara found herself nodding. "He's inside, playing with some wooden blocks I carved for him." Samuel looked up eagerly when they entered the cabin, his face lighting up when he recognized their visitor. "Mr. Garrett, you came back." "I did indeed, son." William settled onto the floor beside Samuel with an ease that spoke of experience with children. "What are you building there?" "A ranch," Samuel said proudly, showing off his arrangement of blocks. "Like yours, with horses and everything. Mama helped me make the fences." William examined the block construction with the seriousness it deserved. "That's fine work. You've got a good eye for layout. Ranch needs proper fences to keep the animals safe." Samuel beamed at the praise. "Will you tell me about your horses, the real ones?" For the next hour, Clara sat quietly mending a shirt while William regaled Samuel with stories of his horses, their names, their personalities, their individual quirks and talents. Samuel hung on every word, asking questions that showed he was not only listening but truly understanding. Clara was amazed at how naturally William related to her son, never talking down to him or dismissing his curiosity. "I've got a mare named Rosie," William was saying. "She's getting older now, not as fast as she used to be, but she's got the gentlest heart you've ever seen. Perfect for teaching children how to ride." Samuel's eyes went wide. "Children can ride horses?" "Sure can, with the right teacher and the right horse." William glanced at Clara. "Your mama would have to say it was all right, of course." "Mama, could I learn to ride a horse?" Samuel's excitement was palpable, and Clara felt her chest tighten with conflicting emotions. "We'll see, sweetheart," Clara said carefully. "That would depend on a lot of things." William seemed to understand her hesitation. Of course it would. Big decision like that needs proper consideration. He turned back to Samuel. "But I'll tell you what, son. If your mama ever decides it's all right, Rosie would be honored to meet you." As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself watching William with growing amazement. He was so natural with Samuel, so patient and encouraging. The child, who usually shrank away from adult men, was completely at ease with this gentle stranger. More than that, Samuel was thriving under William's attention in a way that made Clara's heart ache with what might have been. When William finally prepared to leave, Samuel's face fell with disappointment. "Do you have to go?" "I'm afraid so, son. Got to get back to check on the cattle before dark." William stood, brushing dust from his pants. "But I'll try to come by again soon if your mama doesn't mind." "I don't mind," Samuel said quickly, then looked at Clara with pleading eyes. "Mama doesn't mind either, do you, Mama?" Clara felt William's gaze on her, patient but questioning. The smart thing would be to discourage these visits, to protect herself and Samuel from Frank's inevitable rage when he found out. But looking at her son's bright, hopeful face, seeing the way he'd come alive in William's presence, Clara found herself unable to deny him this small joy. "No," she said quietly, "I don't mind." William's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Then I'll see you both soon." After he left, Samuel chattered excitedly about everything William had told him, reenacting horse stories with his wooden blocks and asking a dozen questions about when they might see him again. Clara listened with a growing sense of both hope and dread, knowing that her son was forming an attachment to a man who represented everything Frank was not, kind, patient, interested in Samuel's thoughts and dreams. That night, as she tucked Samuel into bed, the boy looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mama, why isn't Papa like Mr. Garrett?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. How could she explain to a 4-year-old that his father was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed? How could she make him understand that Frank's cruelty wasn't Samuel's fault without destroying what innocence he had left? "People are different, sweetheart," she said finally. "Some are kind, some are harder. It doesn't mean anything about you." Samuel considered this with the gravity of a much older child. "I wish Mr. Garrett was my papa," he whispered. Clara's heart shattered completely. "Oh, baby," she breathed, gathering him close. I know, I know." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of their cabin and reminding Clara that Frank would be home in just 4 more days. 4 days to figure out how to protect this fragile happiness that had taken root in their lives. 4 days to prepare for the storm that would come when Frank inevitably learned about William's visits. But for tonight, Samuel slept peacefully, dreaming of horses and kind men with patient voices. And Clara allowed herself to dream too, just for a moment, of a world where her son could grow up without fear, where kindness wasn't a rare gift but a daily expectation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight hope was enough. Friday brought news that changed everything. Clara was outside hanging the last of their meager laundry when she saw William's horse approaching at a faster pace than usual. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the urgency in how he sat his saddle. Samuel was playing nearby with his wooden blocks, humming a tune William had taught him about horses running free, but Clara's maternal instincts were already screaming danger. William dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face grave with concern. "Clara, we need to talk." The use of her first name without the formal distance he'd maintained before sent ice through Clara's veins. "What's happened? Is Frank?" "Frank's alive," William said quickly, then paused in a way that made Clara's stomach drop. "But there's been trouble, serious trouble." Samuel looked up from his blocks, sensing the adult tension. "Mr. Garrett, are you okay? You look sad." William's expression softened as he looked at the boy. "I'm worried, son, but not sad. Sometimes grown-ups have to discuss difficult things." He glanced at Clara. "Maybe your mama and I could talk privately for a minute." Clara's hands trembled as she led William behind the cabin, out of Samuel's earshot but where she could still watch him. "Tell me," she whispered. William removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Yesterday evening, Frank got into a fight with one of my other hands. Man named Tobias, good worker, been with me for 3 years. Frank had been drinking, even though I'd made it clear that wasn't allowed." Clara's heart sank. She'd known it was too good to be true, known that Frank couldn't maintain decent behavior for long. How bad? Bad enough. Frank accused Tobias of cheating at cards, though no money was even changing hands. When Tobias tried to walk away, Frank grabbed him, started throwing punches. Tobias defended himself, but William's jaw tightened. Frank pulled a knife. The words hit Clara like physical blows. She'd seen Frank's temper escalate to violence many times, but he'd never used a weapon before. Did he hurt anyone? Cut Tobias across the arm pretty deep before the other hands could stop him. Tobias will heal, but Clara, William's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her blood turn to ice water. Frank was screaming things while they pulled him off. Terrible things about Tobias, about me, about you. Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What kind of things?" "He said Tobias and I were probably both visiting you while he was away. Said a lot worse than that about what kind of woman he thought you were." William's voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the anger underneath. "Then he said something that made my blood run cold." Clara waited, not trusting herself to speak. "He said when he got home, he was going to teach you and that worthless boy a lesson you'd never forget." said maybe it was time to stop wasting food on a child who wasn't worth keeping alive anyway. The world tilted around Clara. She grabbed the wall of the cabin to keep from falling, her breathing coming in short, desperate gasps. She'd always known Frank resented Samuel, but hearing those words spoken aloud, hearing the finality in them, made her realize just how much danger they were truly in. "I fired him on the spot," William continued. "Told him to get his things and get off my property. But he's headed home, and he's drunk and angry and making threats. You and Samuel can't be here when he arrives." Clara's mind raced, but every thought seemed to crash into the same impossible wall. "Where would we go? I have no money, no family, nowhere." "You have somewhere." William's voice was firm, decided. "My ranch. There's a small cabin I use for guests, and you and Samuel would be safe there." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Clara couldn't process it at first. We couldn't impose on you like that. Frank would come looking for us, and if he found us at your place—" "Let me worry about Frank," William said, and there was steel in his voice that reminded Clara he was a man who'd survived and thrived in hard country. "My concern right now is making sure you and that boy are somewhere safe." From around the corner of the cabin came Samuel's voice, raised in innocent question. "Mama, why are you talking so long? I finished the horse barn." Clara looked at William, seeing her own desperation reflected in his eyes. This man, who barely knew them, was offering to risk his own safety to protect them from her husband's violence. The kindness was overwhelming, but so was the terror of what Frank might do if he caught them running. "If we went with you," Clara said carefully, "what happens when Frank sobers up? What happens when he demands we come home?" "We'll face that when it comes," William replied. "But you need to understand something. Frank crossed a line last night, pulling a knife on one of my hands, making threats about harming a woman and child. That's not something that gets forgotten or forgiven. There are going to be consequences for his actions." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Samuel appeared around the corner of the cabin, his face bright with excitement. "Mr. Garrett, come see what I built. It's got stalls for all the horses and a special place for Rosie." William's demeanor shifted instantly, his face smoothing into a gentle smile as he followed Samuel to admire the block construction. Clara watched him crouch down beside her son, praising the careful arrangement of wooden pieces, and felt her heart break with the impossible complexity of their situation. Here was a man who genuinely cared about Samuel, who saw value in a child Frank considered worthless. Here was safety, kindness, the promise of a life where her son could grow up without fear. But accepting William's help meant running away, meant abandoning the only home they'd ever known, meant stepping into an uncertain future with a man they barely knew. "It's beautiful work, son," William was saying to Samuel. "You've got a real talent for this. Maybe someday you could help me design improvements for my real ranch." Samuel's eyes went wide. "Really? I could help with a real ranch?" "I don't see why not. Good ideas come from all kinds of people, no matter how old they are." Clara watched her son bloom under this simple encouragement, and her decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Whatever risks lay ahead, whatever consequences might follow, she couldn't expose Samuel to Frank's escalating violence for one more day. "Mr. Garrett," Clara said quietly, "if your offer is sincere, Samuel and I would be grateful to accept it." William's relief was visible. "It's sincere. We should go now before Frank has time to make it back." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Clara packed their few possessions into 2 worn saddlebags, while William helped Samuel carefully wrap his precious wooden blocks in an old blanket. There wasn't much to take. A few changes of clothes, Clara's mother's Bible, the blocks Samuel had carved, and the small amount of money Clara had been hiding for emergencies. "What about Papa?" Samuel asked as Clara helped him into his jacket. "Won't he be sad if we're not here when he comes home?" Clara's throat closed with emotion. Even after everything Frank had put him through, Samuel's innocent heart still held love for his father. "Papa's going to be away working for a while," she managed. "Mr. Garrett is going to let us stay at his ranch until Papa comes back." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Clara had no idea what would happen when Frank discovered they were gone, or whether they would ever be able to return to this cabin that had been both home and prison. William lifted Samuel onto his horse with gentle care, settling the boy in front of him where he'd be safe and secure. Clara mounted Frank's old mare, the one animal Frank wouldn't immediately miss, and tried not to think about the fact that she was essentially stealing her husband's property along with everything else. As they rode away from the cabin, Samuel twisted around to wave goodbye to the only home he'd ever known. "We'll come back soon, right, Mama?" Clara couldn't trust her voice to answer. Over Samuel's head, her eyes met William's, and she saw understanding there. They both knew there might be no coming back from this choice, no returning to the way things had been. The ride to William's ranch took most of the afternoon, with frequent stops to rest Samuel and water the horses. Clara found herself studying their destination as they crested the final hill, a sprawling operation with well-maintained buildings, healthy-looking cattle, and an air of prosperity that spoke of hard work and careful management. The main house was larger than she'd expected, built of solid timber with a wide porch that suggested hospitality and comfort. "The guest cabin is just behind the main house," William explained as they approached. "It's small but clean, with a good stove and comfortable beds. You and Samuel will have complete privacy." The guest cabin proved to be more than Clara had dared hope for: 2 rooms with real glass windows, a stone fireplace, and furniture that, while simple, was well-made and cared for. Samuel ran from room to room, marveling at the luxury of having so much space, while Clara stood in the doorway struggling with emotions she couldn't name. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. "No thanks needed," William replied. "Just keep that boy safe and help him grow strong. That's payment enough for any decent man." That evening, as Clara tucked Samuel into the first real bed he'd ever slept in, the boy looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mama, is this our home now?" Clara smoothed his hair back from his forehead, marveling at how much healthier he looked already, just from a few hours away from Frank's toxic presence. "I don't know, sweetheart, but whatever happens, we're together and we're safe." "I like it here," Samuel whispered. "Mr. Garrett is nice to me. He doesn't get angry when I cough or ask questions." Clara's heart clenched. "No, baby, he doesn't get angry at you at all." As Samuel drifted off to sleep, Clara stood at the window looking out over William's ranch. Somewhere behind them, Frank was probably discovering their absence, probably working himself into a rage that would make his previous violence seem mild. But for tonight, Samuel was sleeping peacefully in a real bed, in a place where his cough wouldn't bring punishment and his questions wouldn't bring ridicule. Whatever tomorrow brought, Clara thought, this night of peace was worth any price they might have to pay. Outside, she could see William moving among his horses, checking on them before bed. The sight of him, steady and capable and kind, made Clara's chest tight with something that might have been hope if she dared to name it. But hope was dangerous. Hope had led her into marriage with Frank, had convinced her that love could change a violent man, had nearly cost her and Samuel everything. Still, as she watched William's gentle movements among his animals, Clara allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to live without fear, to raise her son in a place where kindness was the rule rather than the exception. The wondering, she told herself, couldn't hurt anyone. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. Hope was the most dangerous thing of all, because once it took root, it was almost impossible to kill. And despite everything, despite all the reasons she had to be afraid, hope was already growing in Clara's heart like wildflowers after rain. Clara woke to the sound of approaching horses, too many horses, moving too fast. Dawn was just breaking over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but the thundering hoofbeats shattered the peaceful morning like breaking glass. She was at the window before she was fully awake, her heart hammering with the kind of terror that had become second nature during her years with Frank. Through the glass, she could see 5 riders approaching the main house. Frank led them, sitting his horse with the swaggering confidence of a man who believed righteousness was on his side. Clara recognized 2 of the other men, Jake Morrison and Pete Henley, drinking companions of Frank's who shared his taste for violence and his contempt for anyone they considered weak. The other 2 were strangers, but their hard faces and the casual way they wore their guns suggested they weren't here for friendly conversation. Samuel stirred in the bed behind her, mumbling something in his sleep about horses and sunshine. Clara's throat closed with panic. How had Frank found them so quickly? More importantly, how had he convinced 4 other men to ride with him? Frank could be persuasive when he wanted something, but this felt different, organized, dangerous in a way that made Clara's blood turn to ice. Outside, she could see William emerging from the main house, fully dressed despite the early hour. He moved with calm deliberation, but Clara noticed he was wearing his gun belt, something she'd never seen him do around the ranch. Behind him came 3 other men, ranch hands, Clara assumed, drawn by the sound of the approaching riders. Frank's voice carried across the morning air, loud and belligerent with drink and righteous fury. "Garrett, I know you've got my wife and boy in there. Send them out and we can settle this like civilized men." William's response was too quiet for Clara to hear, but his posture spoke of controlled tension. The conversation continued for several minutes, voices rising and falling, until suddenly Frank's bellow cut through everything else. "You had no right. Those are my wife and child, and I'll be damned if I let some fancy rancher steal them from me." Samuel woke fully at the sound of his father's voice, his small body going rigid with instinctive fear. "Mama, why is Papa here? Why does he sound angry?" Clara gathered Samuel into her arms, her mind racing through impossible options. They were trapped in the cabin with nowhere to run, facing down 5 armed men who had no qualms about violence. William and his hands were outnumbered, and even if they weren't, Clara couldn't bear the thought of good men dying because of her problems. "Mama," Samuel's voice was small, scared, "are we in trouble?" Before Clara could answer, the sound of breaking glass came from the main house, followed by shouting and the crash of overturned furniture. Clara's heart stopped as she realized Frank and his men had forced their way inside, probably searching for her and Samuel. That's when she heard William's voice, raised in anger for the first time since she'd known him. "Get out of my house. You've got no right." The sound of a gunshot split the morning air. Clara's world tilted sideways. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from screaming, clutching Samuel against her chest as her son began to shake with terror. Another shot followed, then another, and the sound of men shouting and cursing filled the air. "I want my wife and boy," Frank's voice roared above the chaos. "Bring them out now, or I swear to God I'll burn this whole place down." Samuel was crying now, soft whimpering sobs that broke Clara's heart. She had to make a choice: stay hidden and pray the violence would pass them by, or surrender herself and Samuel to Frank's fury to prevent more bloodshed. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Stay here, baby," Clara whispered to Samuel, trying to settle him on the bed. "Stay right here and don't make any noise, no matter what happens." "Mama, no," Samuel grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Don't go out there. Papa's really angry." Clara's vision blurred with tears. Her 4-year-old son was already too familiar with his father's rages, already knew to be afraid when Frank's voice reached that particular pitch of fury. "I have to, sweetheart, but you stay here, okay? Promise Mama you'll stay right here." Samuel's lower lip trembled. "What if Papa hurts you?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. How could she promise her son that everything would be all right when she knew it wouldn't? How could she lie to those trusting eyes when they both knew what Frank was capable of? "Mr. Garrett will protect us," Clara said finally, praying it wasn't a lie. "You remember how kind he is. He won't let anything bad happen." As if summoned by her words, William's voice rose above the chaos outside. "Hutchins, your quarrel is with me, not with innocent people. If you want to settle this, we settle it man to man." Frank's laughter was ugly, tinged with madness and drink. "Innocent? You call stealing a man's family innocent? You call turning a wife against her husband innocent?" Clara felt sick. Frank was painting himself as the wronged party, the faithful husband betrayed by his wife's infidelity. It was a story that would resonate with the kind of men he'd brought with him, men who believed wives were property and interference with that property was a hanging offense. The sound of approaching footsteps made Clara's blood freeze. Heavy boots on the porch of the guest cabin, the creak of the front door being tested. Then Frank's voice, closer now, speaking to someone just outside their refuge. "Check that cabin. If they're not in the main house, they're hiding in there like rats in a hole." Clara looked around desperately for anything she could use to defend herself and Samuel. The cabin had no back door, no windows large enough to climb through, no weapons except a poker by the fireplace. If Frank's men came through that door, there would be nowhere to run. Samuel must have sensed her desperation, because he stopped crying and looked at her with eyes far too old for his young face. "Mama, I'm scared." "I know, baby, me too." Clara pulled him close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair, memorizing the feel of his small body against hers. "But whatever happens, remember that Mama loves you more than anything in the world." The door exploded inward with a crash that made them both jump. Jake Morrison filled the doorway, his face flushed with excitement and alcohol. Behind him came Pete Henley, grinning like this was all some grand adventure. "Well, well," Jake drawled, his eyes fixing on Clara with undisguised malice. "Look what we got here, Frank's runaway wife and the little weakling." Samuel pressed closer to Clara, his small body trembling. Clara straightened her spine and tried to summon whatever dignity she could manage. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're just—" "Just what?" Pete interrupted, stepping into the cabin like he owned it. "Just whoring around with the fancy rancher while your husband's off working to support you." The accusation hit Clara like a slap, but she forced herself not to react. These men wanted to see her shame, wanted to justify whatever they planned to do by painting her as an adulteress who deserved punishment. "I've done nothing improper," Clara said as steadily as she could manage. "Mr. Garrett offered us shelter, nothing more." Jake's laugh was cruel. "Sure he did, and I suppose you just happened to need shelter the exact same time your husband was away working." Before Clara could respond, Frank himself appeared in the doorway. Up close, she could see the full extent of his rage, the bloodshot eyes, the trembling hands, the flush of fever that accompanied his worst episodes. He looked at her and Samuel with such hatred that Clara instinctively stepped backward. "My loving wife," Frank said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "My devoted Clara me, who couldn't wait to spread her legs for the first rich man who showed her attention." "Frank, please," Clara whispered. "Samuel's here, he doesn't need to hear." "He needs to hear exactly what kind of whore his mother is," Frank roared, spittle flying from his lips. "Needs to understand why decent folks cross the street when they see trash like us coming." Samuel began to cry again, loud sobs that seemed to echo off the cabin walls. Frank's attention shifted to his son with laser focus, and Clara saw something in his expression that made her blood turn to ice. "And you," Frank said, advancing on Samuel, "you worthless little weakling, you're the reason all this started. If you just died like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened." Clara threw herself between Frank and Samuel without thinking. "Don't you dare touch him." Frank's backhanded blow sent Clara sprawling across the cabin floor, her head striking the wooden wall with a crack that made Samuel scream. Stars exploded across her vision, and when she tried to get up, the world spun sickeningly around her. "Mama!" Samuel's voice was high and desperate as he tried to reach her, but Frank grabbed the boy by his shirt and hauled him upright. 4 years old and still crying like a baby, Frank snarled, shaking Samuel until the child's teeth rattled. "Still sick all the time, still weak, still useless. Maybe it's time to put you out of your misery." Clara struggled to her feet, her vision clearing just enough to see Frank's hands around Samuel's throat. Her son's face was turning red, his small hands clawing desperately at his father's grip, and Clara felt something primal and fierce explode in her chest. "Let him go!" Clara launched herself at Frank with all the strength she possessed, clawing at his arms and face, trying to break his grip on Samuel. "He's your son, your own son." Frank released Samuel to deal with Clara's attack, and the boy collapsed to the floor gasping and choking. Frank's fist connected with Clara's stomach, doubling her over, then grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. "My son," Frank laughed bitterly. "Look at him, weak, sickly, worthless. That's not my blood in him. That's your tainted blood, your weakness poisoning everything it touches." Clara could barely breathe through the pain, but she forced herself to speak. He's just a little boy, Frank. He never did anything to deserve." "He deserves to die," Frank screamed, his grip tightening in her hair until she saw stars. "And after I finish with him, I'm going to make you watch while I gut that rancher who thought he could steal what's mine." That's when the second door to the cabin opened, the one Clara hadn't even known existed. William Garrett stepped through it like an avenging angel, his face cold as winter stone and his gun drawn with deadly purpose. "Let her go, Hutchins." Frank spun around, dragging Clara with him as a human shield. "Garrett, come to rescue your whore." William's eyes flicked to Samuel, who was still gasping on the floor, then to Clara's bloody face, then back to Frank. When he spoke, his voice was calm as deep water, but Clara could hear the rage beneath it. "I've seen enough," William said quietly. "This ends now." Frank's grip on Clara tightened, and she felt the cold press of a knife blade against her throat. "Does it? Seems to me you're outgunned and outmanned. My boys are waiting outside, and one word from me. Your boys are dead." The simple statement hit the cabin like lightning. Frank's face went white, then red, then white again. "You're lying." "Am I?" William's smile was cold as January wind. "Jake took a bullet through the heart when he tried to draw on me. Pete's got a hole in his chest that's probably finished bleeding him out by now. The other two decided discretion was the better part of valor and rode off fast as their horses could carry them." Clara felt Frank's hand begin to shake against her throat. "You killed my men." "I defended my property and the people under my protection," William replied, "which is exactly what I'm going to keep doing until this is finished." Samuel had managed to crawl closer to the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps but his eyes fixed on William with something like hope. Clara tried to catch her son's attention, to signal him to stay down and stay quiet, but Frank's grip kept her from moving. "So what's it going to be, Hutchins?" William continued, never taking his eyes off Frank. "You going to hide behind a woman and child, or are you going to face me like a man?" Frank's laugh was high and brittle. "Face you? Why would I face you when I can just cut her throat and be done with it?" The knife pressed deeper and Clara felt a trickle of blood run down her neck. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm descend over her. If she was going to die, at least Samuel would be safe. William would make sure of that. "Because," William said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "if you hurt one hair on that woman's head, I will make sure your death takes hours instead of seconds. And I will make sure you feel every cut, every bullet, every moment of pain that you've given to them." Frank's hand was shaking badly now, the knife wavering against Clara's throat. She could smell the fear sweat on him, could feel the tremors running through his body as the reality of his situation sank in. You can't just kill me," Frank stammered. "There are laws." "Are there?" William's smile was terrible. "Because it seems to me you came onto my land with armed men, broke into my house, threatened my guests, and are currently holding a knife to an innocent woman's throat. I'd say that makes you a threat that needs to be eliminated." The standoff stretched for an eternity, 3 adults frozen in a tableau of violence while a small boy watched with terrified eyes. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Frank's pulse racing against her back, could sense William's controlled readiness like a coiled spring waiting to be released. Then Samuel spoke, his voice small but clear in the deadly silence. "Papa, why do you want to hurt us?